I have to say, when I first saw the announcement about doing book reviews, uh, sometime I just do a book I've already read, but I thought this would be a good chance, to read a book that I should read, but I might not. So I thought I would read Elaine Pagels' new book. But before I made a move on that, Christine Boles showed it. And I thought, good, that means I can read it and I can have her comments after I read it. So that'll make my reading more useful. So, shortly after that, I read the review in the New York Times. Uh, the title of the review was Science Friction. And, it's a book about artificial intelligence and, artificial general intelligence and the so-called singularity and all kinds of, I guess I would say, far-fetched ideas. And it was a quite, I thought, fetching review. And it said it was, wonderfully well written. I don't think it's wonderfully well written. I think that the person only reads science books. And so it sounded wonderfully well written if all you read was science books. But if you had a larger reading list, it wouldn't be that. Anyway, no, it's a book that kind of had the title when you read it doesn't make sense. It's called More Everything Forever. AI Overlords, Space Empires, and Silicon Valley's Crusade to Control the Fate of Humanity by Adam Becker. Adam Becker, he has a bachelor's degree from Cornell, and he earned a PhD in astrophysics from Michigan. So he's certainly not scientifically illiterate. And what this book is about, it's about a lot of, if you just read, if you just have a look in the world, you notice that now everybody is talking about artificial intelligence. I brought this a couple of weeks ago in the New York Times, the Sunday New York Times, and it has an article on the front page about how a number of universities are now handing out artificial intelligence, I guess, kind of like an email account to all the students. So that each student will have his own AI account and chat box. And this student can get have paper read and have, child. He can run his entire college life by his own individualized AI account. Which made me think, I am really glad I retired from teaching in 2019. I say that because I had just had a lunch with a Pulitzer Prize winning professor at Rice who told me that he was interested in AI. And so he asked AI to write a little history of Rice University. And so it spit out a little history of Rice University, which is interesting and sometimes had correct information. But it had the first president of Rice was not a person who ever existed, never was the president of Rice. And it listed many of the original faculty of Rice. Most of the names it gave were fake names. And some of the names that it gave that were not fake names were people who had never taught at Rice. But he said, if you just read it, it sounded really authentic and really real. Like the subject, you knew it was not true. And I saw that he had an editorial in the Chronicle the last week or so about how HISD were using some images in classes in which the images were fake and fraudulent and didn't fit and so forth. So this, I guess I'd say, raised my hackles a little bit about artificial intelligence. So anyway, this book is not entirely an attack. It tries to be a relatively objective account of artificial intelligence, and then something called artificial general intelligence, and then more than that, a number of ideas that seem to me to be almost, not almost, absolutely science fictional. And then a lot of people who believe that AI can in some sense be the greatest thing that ever happened to the world. That will mean that if we use AI correctly, the AI will be able to create more energy, more food, more everything, everywhere for everybody, and it will last forever. And so it can be used to kind of abolish the idea that there are limits on anything. Hence the title, more, everything, forever. Others believe that AI could destroy the world, destroy humans, destroy civilization, and that it could happen in 5 years or certainly in our lifetimes. And then other people talk about how that the earth could support 80 or 100 billion people. We have about a little over 8 billion people now, and we're talking about running out of resources. Some people say that the earth could support 80 billion people. Others say that if we only think about humans on earth and about sustainability, and we confine ourselves to the earth, we're being needlessly limited in how we think. Because we have the solar system, and we have our galaxy, and we have numberless other galaxies. So that if we thought about moving humans to Mars or to the Andromeda Nebulae, we could imagine AI allowing us to eliminate death, eliminate all disease. We can imagine a population in the universe of more than 1 trillion people. And they say, just think if you had 1 trillion people, and you imagine mankind not having a limited existence, but living for, let's say, a minimum of 1 million more years. What we call humans, identifiable in human, have been around for 50 or 100,000 years. So we're talking about if we expand our imagination for human existence to 1 billion years, and we expand the population of humans not from 8 billion to 1 trillion or more, they just think how wonderful that could be. How you could have thousands of Mozarts and thousands of Einsteins and so forth. And so for some people, these kind of ideas predict total destruction. For others, it predicts almost a utopia. He begins by talking about a lot of people who talk about sort of more everything, more everywhere, everything. He talks about a guy named Eric Drexler, who talks about the ability to manipulate the atomic structure of stones or wood or anything else to change that into anything we wanted to do. So there wouldn't be any shortage of any kind of precious metal or mineral, because we could manipulate the molecular structure of whatever was at hand and turn it into alchemical life into what we wanted. I actually remember one time, I was sitting next to Richard Smalley. Richard Smalley was a chemist at Rice, who in the 1990s was the most widely cited chemist in the world. And he won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1996. And he had just read a book by Eric Drexler, who was talking about the marvels of kind of nanotechnology. If you were at Rice in the 80s, 90s, it was nano everything. And Smalley, who was clearly a genius, was unbelievably enthralled at first by Drexler's idea. And I was a part of a little team. Rice had little horse and pony shows to alumni centers. And you could fly, 3 or 4 professors to Dallas or Chicago to talk to alumni. And oftentimes, a little group I would go and I would talk about the history of Rice And Richard Smalley would go and talk about science in class today. And George Rupp would go and talk about the future of class. That's our little pony show. So I would sit beside Smalley flying someplace. And he taught incessantly. And he was amazingly interesting. And he had just read this Drexler book. And he thought that nanoscience was going to be the salvation of the world. And he thought that we'd be able to take any molecule that we had and we could disassemble it and take the constituent parts and put it together and make something totally different. So we would never run out of anything. And whatever we were short of, rare earths or whatever, we could just generate. Now, I have to say, I knew absolutely nothing about what he was talking. But in my ignorance, it sounded absurd. Now, it turns out, I found out that Smalley himself later decided it was absurd. There's a 2 or 3 page discussion in this book of Smalley having a debate with Drexler, telling him why that wasn't true. So Smalley was smart. Smalley goes ahead, and discovers Buckminster fullerene of buckyballs and all that. So anyway, this is an idea that we don't have to be worried about shortages of anything. That science and technology will be the salvation of mankind. And anything we need, we can create, we can generate. That does seem kind of weird. And then he talks about artificial intelligence. His artificial intelligence obviously does a lot of things really well. And artificial intelligence works best when it's set to do a precise, well-defined test. And the person who's using it is really informed about what's happening, like pattern recognition. So, for example, I know that the pathologists who look to try to discover abnormalities. If you have a computer in which you fed, I don't know, 100 million images of X-rays and taught that computer how to recognize certain kinds of abnormalities, the computer you can take an X-ray of a person, put it in your computer, and AI can give you a decision in a nanosecond, a whole lot better than scientists could, because it has a memory bank of hundreds of images. So you see, he recognizes in that way that nanoscience, like robotics, the robots can do really well, really quickly, really accurately, well-defined, precise things in an orderly way. You know, like a chassis coming by on a chain, and his arm reaches down and sticks the door in the right spot. It can do that 1,000 times a day, never gets sick, never complains, because it's always when the arm comes down, the chassis is right there, it's in the right spot, and the door's been hooked to this thing, and it works perfectly. But if something's off, the robot gets confused. And so that's, again, he makes the point that robotics things, if the task is repetitive, precise, and it's being overseen by accurate, by a person knows what they're doing. But he says AI, some people are afraid of, is that AI can become so smart that it can begin to regenerate advanced versions of itself. The AI could begin to, in an iterative way, begin to make improvements of itself. And then that improvement could rapidly make a further improvement. And each further improvement was bigger and better and faster than the next. And it would just sort of get out of control. And then hypothetical time in the future, AI can create what in various ways is called a singularity. And the singularity poses this hypothetical time when computers will have more intelligence than all human minds combined. Now, again, some people say this promises unimaginable benefits to humankind. And they are the ones who begin to say, if you had computers They're infinitely more intelligent than all human minds combined. Just think of the kind of medical and scientific and other kind of advances you can make. And you can imagine curing all diseases and curing pollution and curing all of them. And others raise the question, well, that presumes that the artificial intelligence intentions are in alignment with human intention. Which Adam Becker says it even begins to raise the question about how accurate is it to talk about a computer's artificial intelligence having intention. We don't actually even have a really accurate idea of what intelligence is. People can test really high on certain intelligence tests and not have enough sense to drive a car out of a parking lot. There was a super brilliant mathematician who came to us in 1914 to teach. He was thought to be a prodigy like Einstein. The students wanted to make fun of him, and he was totally inadequate teaching. He taught about 2 years, realized that, he couldn't handle people. He ended up spending the rest of his life collecting tolls at the subway in New York City. He was clearly kind of an off-the-charts genius, but he had others such absence of skills he couldn't survive in life. So the person says, so let's imagine you have computers that can create an intelligence and then recreate to the point that is infinitely better than any human mind. Could that intelligence not turn against me? Now, Asimov, the famous science fiction writer back in the 40s and 50s, wrote a lot of books about robots. And he had what he called the so-called 3 laws of robots. And the first law of robots is that robots would not harm humans. Well, that's as Asimov wanted it to be. How could, if we had computers that could replicate themselves and become smarter and smarter and smarter and take over the world, how would we know, how would we guarantee, how could we make sure their attitudes and their values were in line with humanity's values? And in fact, in 2023, about 700 quite eminent computer people in Silicon Valley signed a proclamation asking that companies stop doing research on artificial intelligence until they could work out protocols that would guarantee that these super smart and always getting smarter computers would never have attitudes or intentions counter to the needs of humans. Others thought that was putting a limit, and they thought we should put no limit on scientific investigation. And then other people in the Silicon Valley field began to talk about what they call artificial general intelligence, or AGI. And that to them both held out more promise and more fear. Because artificial intelligence is, from the beginning, relatively narrowly defined. But what if you could create computers that had infinite knowledge in every field and were uncontrollable in what they went to? And if you could actually create ways to penetrate the human mind and then somehow sort of take the ideas and the intelligence and the creativity out of human brains and upload them into a computer. So that in some sense, a computer capable of AGI would replace the human. If you think we define the person as being dead when they're brain dead, So in some sense, we're sort of defining life as brain activity. What if that brain activity biological bodies and became part of the memory of computers? Then in that sense, you might say that humans could live forever, but they wouldn't be biologically human. They would be, I don't know, data in a massive computer bank. But there are a lot of scientists in Silicon Valley who are working on this, on AGI, and are hypothesizing a future of mankind that is all powerful, all knowing, and eternal. Which Becker says, this sounds like religious language. When you're talking about humans creating an extra human thing that replaces humans, that can live forever and can do everything and know everything, maybe that's exciting, and maybe that's, uplifting. Maybe that is really, really scary. And then he began to talk about people, the scientists who believe that because of pollution and because of, political stupidity and because of possible atomic war, that we might kill all humans on Earth. And so they began to say, if we really are committed to humanity, we should try to figure out ways to make sure we have what we might almost call lifeboats, so that humans are not confined just to the Earth. And so where else could humans live? Well, the moon is close by. Mars is, as close as about 36 million miles away. It might be potentially a place humans could stay. And then there are, in theory, in our galaxy, a number of possible planets, maybe 10,000, but there are probably billions of galaxies. So if we would begin to think about, like, if you only had two special breeds of tigers, and their habitat was being used up in India somewhere, then zoos would create a place around the world you could have other habitats so you could keep tigers alive. Well, we should think about having places for humans to live other than the Earth, so we can guarantee that humanity can survive in a biological form, not just memory chip or something. Elon Musk is one of the people who believe this. Elon Musk is quoted in this book a lot. Elon Musk is a person, my favorite line from Elon Musk is he thought empathy was the most stupid idea Western civilization ever had. That's the reason he doesn't mind saving millions to spend on his rockets and letting 300,000 people starve to death in Ethiopia somewhere, because empathy is stupid. But anyway, Elon Musk said 3 or 4 years ago that he thought there would be a million people living on Mars within 20 years. And his goal is to send a rocket and send humans to Mars. And Alan Becker, who's an astrophysicist, says, there are a lot of ideas. He'll talk about other ideas of creating artificial Earths, as it were, in our solar system. But he said, let's think about Mars. First place, to get 20 million people, to get 1 million people to Mars in 20 years. If you sent a rocket every day of the year, carrying 100 people, years of a daily rocket to get 1 million people to Mars. And then when you get to Mars, because there's no magnetic field and essentially no atmosphere, radiation from the sun will be unbelievably deadly. So you have to live underground. There's no water, but it's so cold and so dry. The water on you, the slobber on your tongue will blow away. And the dust on the Martian surface is moistness. So it's too cold. There's no air. There's no water. The radiation is deadly, and the dust is deadly. Other than that, no problem. So let's imagine you could get 100,000 people to Mars. They'd have to live underground. If they ever came above, they'd be wearing spacesuits. Everything they ate and drank would have to be come from Mars for Earth. If you could create underground some kind of place where you could grow crops, in addition to having to import food and water, you have to import insects. Because insects pollinate the plants. So we don't think about creating human life off this earth. But if you're going to have plants that are going to grow, you have to have pollinating mechanisms. And we don't actually know how well bees work, in respect, and can they fly in this almost no atmosphere? I mean, we got to think about this. And he says, look, no matter how healthy people are, when you leave, it takes 9 months or so to get to Mars. And let's say you get to Mars, and all of a sudden you have, appendicitis. You can't just go to the ER, and it takes minutes and minutes and minutes for human time, at the speed of light. I mean, if you're on Mars, if you're on the moon, it takes about 1.3 seconds for radio contact. 10 minutes. So he says, so if the idea of sending 1 million people to Mars as a lifeboat to preserve humanity is on the surface side pretty doggone absurd. You might say, well, why go so far away to Mars? What about the moon? The moon is just, 250,000 miles away. He said the moon is actually worse than Mars. It's older. Almost there's no air. Terrible radiation problems. Precious little water. We don't know the long-range impact on humans of low gravity and so forth. We do know when people come back from being orbiting for months, they have trouble walking and so forth. So others will say, well, why confine ourselves to Mars? Well, first place, Venus is hotter than molten lead. So it's kind of hard to imagine life on a planet that's hotter than molten lead. And he goes through all the different, of course not Jupiter and so forth. Maybe one of those dozens and dozens of moons around Jupiter, Saturn. But he goes through them all and no, not more. And so the nearest star is 4.7 light years away. That one doesn't seem to have anything like any planetary body. But let's imagine you can find a convenient planet that have some kind of atmosphere and maybe a magnetic field to deflect the solar radiation and maybe water. Let's say like only 5 light years away. He says that the fastest a human has ever been catapulted is slightly less than 25,000 miles an hour. The speed to escape the Earth's gravity is about 24,500 or so. 25,000 miles an hour, it would take you millions of years to get to the nearest star. I mean, light travels at 186,300 miles per second, or about 650 million miles per hour. Which means that the light in 1 year would travel something like 7 trillion miles. So if the nearest inhabitable planet in another galaxy is 5 light years away, that's a mere 35 trillion miles away. So let's imagine that we could create a spaceship that would travel 100,000 miles an hour. It take millions of years to get there. So people have proposed making giant spacecraft and we should put people on board, and those people would die, but they would have children. And then those children would have children. And then after like 1,000 generations, that spaceship would land in Alpha Centauri somewhere, and those grandchildren would step off. Is that feasible? So back in the 70s, there was a physicist at Princeton named Gerald O'Neill, who wrote a book that maybe you remember being talked about in Time Magazine and so forth, called The High Frontier. And O'Neill was also concerned about this idea of when the Earth was running out of space, and was there going to be a shortage of food, and would nuclear war end mankind? So he proposed creating what again I call lifeboats. And these lifeboats were to be human manufactured cylinders. The smallest would be about 20 miles long and about 4 miles wide. So you can imagine this unbelievably big cylinder. And then you fill it, 15, 20 feet deep with dirt all around. So you can put in a lot of water, you have soil, and you spin this cylinder. And if you were a human walking around in that cylinder, you'd have a sense of gravity. And then you could grow crops. So you could put people and insects and plants in this cylinder, 20 miles long, diameter, filled with earth and water, rotating. And people said, well, how would you build something that big? It would take like 1 million rockets, taking up, cargo loads the size of a Greyhound bus. But it would take, he said, well, we have to create mass drivers. And these mass drivers would catapult huge chunks of the moon into Earth orbit. And people said, well, what are these mass drivers? He said, well, we haven't invented those yet. And I said, well, what would they look like? Well, how would they be powered? He said, that's for science to answer. And he says, we have to think of the Earth as like the cradle of mankind, where babies go. And babies don't live their entire life in the cradle. So humans shouldn't expect to spend the entire lifetime of humans on the Earth as a cradle. We know we need to get, so O'Neill imagined dozens and dozens of these rotating cylinders. Most of them will be 30 miles and 5 miles in diameter, spinning. filled with earth and water and humans and insects and so forth. And that's where humans live.
What's their source again?
That's for science to discover. And so, I mean, this is the physicists at Princeton imagining stuff that is, if it were written in a form fiction, a science fiction novel, it would say, that's not even believable enough to make me want to read it. And he wrote a famous book about this. And that's what Adam Becker goes to all these kind of stuff, these unbelievably far-fetched ideas of what supercomputers and artificial general intelligence and sort of untrammeled science can do. And as an astrophysicist who knows the language, can read the mathematics, and can ask tough questions, basically says much of this is hogwash. And people, and many of these people who are doing this are billionaires who are smart in certain aspects of life. Again, Musk is a person who in certain aspects of life is a very smart person. In other aspects of life, Musk doesn't have the sense of a cat. You know, so you, and so he said, these, like Peter Thiel is one of the billionaire computer people. He's the person who funded J.D. Vance's Central Committee. Vance poo-poos the idea of democracy. He thinks you need one intelligent leader to rule. And he thinks that education, other than narrowly defined computer education, is silly. He actually, each year, he gives out $100,000 fellowships to people who have never gone to college, so they'll never go to college, because he wants people, he says, whose minds are not messed up with history and science and philosophy and religion. He says, why do we need to know about what happened in the past? Think about tomorrow. And Becker, the guy with a PhD in astrophysics, says, this is one of the most severe limitations of these people. They are brilliant in certain kind of ways, but they have what he would call a limited understanding of humans, of human potential, of human life. Everything to them has to be something that can be given a numerical value. He calls it kind of an algorithmic arrogance. He says, you know, for example, you actually can't assign numerical values to things like love or compassion or faith. And that there's no sense of what is joy. And he actually uses the phrase, which I kind of like. He says these people practice what he called humanity's denialism. Yeah, so I can see that. And then he talked about something, hope this doesn't hurt anybody's feelings, but having taught at Rice for a lot of years, I can see what he called and the engineer disease, he says, is smart people who have mastered some very complicated topic, like, I don't know, computer engineering, and then say, since I've mastered that, I can know everything. And therefore, since they know this, they are experts in everything. And I've had a lot of conversations with really smart engineers at Rice who know more about English or history or philosophy or government than anybody in the world except them. Because they have, published 400 papers, have 20 patents, whatever. And so he says we have this problem. A lot of the people at the highest level in Silicon Valley with billions of dollars to dedicate to this are working as hard as they can on artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence before they or their like-minded people have come to a decision on how do we know that if we can create this, that this artificial general intelligence will have values that align with human values. If we proceed without working out that system of control, we, the machine, will end humanity. And several of them said, I think, we're all probably in 4 or 5 years, we'll be to the point. We'll be so near to what he calls the singularity that humans may never make another invention because henceforth all inventions will be made by computers. And that there may be no other worthwhile human insight after about 10 years. Because massive artificial general intelligence will be doing it all for everybody. So that her idea. But right after reading that, I read this article in the New York Times by Leaf Webby. I have no idea who that is, but that Leaf is the director of the Digital Theory Lab at New York University. And he said there's already a lot of companies are not hiring young programmers because the computers are programming themselves. And he says there's a real drop-off already in the ability of computer science graduates to do programming. He says we make it to the point where humans lose that ability. The way already a lot of schools don't even teach writing in script. I mean, my grandkids, Klein Collins, they're smart kids. It's a good school. They didn't learn script. Which means if I gave them a letter that Jefferson wrote, they couldn't read it because Jefferson didn't type. And so he raises the question. AI is coming, but coders who made it. Again, that's the guy who knows something about what he writes. And he gives a lot of examples about having computers do everything. It's like you say, why do you need to learn to do simple math and everything? Because you have calculators. If you get to a place where people are basically illiterate, they're depending on AI to do everything, we may have lost everything. And he says, in other words, this is balm to my soul. I think we have to return to the arts to make our way forward in the age of AI. For students today, studying math and language might turn out to be the only way to be flexible enough to face a rapidly changing market in which a computer science degree is no longer a guarantee of a job. But it's also a way to deepen our humanity in the face of these strange machines we have built and to understand them. And that is something that AI will never do. So I have to say, I have zero intelligence in this. I read email and I word process. Anything else happen? Open my door and find the nearest graduate student to come show me what's wrong with my computer. But Adam Becker is important. And this is I think, a quite exciting book about some of the ideas that are here proposed, about some of the possibilities, some of the dangers, and some of the really limited thinking behind some really smart people. And I have to say, another interesting thing, I was kind of surprised that I find Richard Smalley in here. If you also advise, you may remember a guy that teaching there named Roger Penrose. Roger Penrose is one of the great scientific minds of the 20th century. He's in Cambridge, he has a PhD in physics, he has a Nobel Prize in physics. He was a good friend of Lonnie West. You may remember Lonnie West was here. And Penrose has written a very elaborate critique of the whole idea of the AGI and the end of the universe. So it's kind of from, well, Roger Penrose says that. But, I do think if you have some vague interest in AI, and this is a book that I wouldn't say I understood everything in this book, but I understood more than I thought I would. So the guy writes clearly enough that you don't have to be a PhD in physics to understand it. And it raises questions, and it makes you just wonder about some of the kind of ideas that are being proposed and talked about in today's world. It's already 9:30, I think, but anyway, this is the book. Adam Becker, More, Everything, Forever.
Thank you so much.
Any questions? I can answer in great depth here. Now, and then well,
Does he ever deal with anything about like, you have using a phrase that can tell us like good of humanity or humanity's values?
yeah,
I mean, I see lots of different values in humanity these days, especially. Is there any, when dealing, is he talking about dealing with the variation of what are human values?
no, he says, even for example, like you talk about like a computer can replicate human intelligence. We don't even actually know what human intelligence is. There's one thing about taking an exam, what about creativity? You know, so we don't even have this most simple idea of intelligence. We don't have a adequate definition of. What is humanity? What are culture? An incredible variety of cultures. You know, so just the idea that people throw around ideas as though they're simple and can be assigned a numerical value and that a computer can replicate it. So unbelievably oversimplifies the complexity of life and humanity. That's, and he talks about singing a beautiful pastoral scene, trees and sheep and so forth, you know, and tries to imagine a computer seeing that image and getting the same joy from it that he did. And what we talk about sentient beings. Some people think that the computers are on the edge now of being sentient. Then if you unplug the computer, would that be killing it? Is that murder?
Anti-computer abortion now.
Okay.
I think everybody in this room is old enough to remember Hal.
Yeah.
When the first time we saw
Yes,
his house
yes.
on Space Odyssey, and
Yeah.
so you suddenly have a conscious creature.
Yes.
In the form of a computer who becomes JALOUS, you know, of the guy that's doing the program and figures out that he needs to do a little upsmanship.
That was written by Arthur Clarke, and this guy grew up reading science fiction. And he says a lot of these people grew up reading science fiction. And a lot of the ideas they pick up comes from they saw 2,000 or something like that, you know. I mean, it's not based necessarily on hard science. It's based on, they read something Richard Heinlein wrote or something in 1939. So it's made me think, I don't, English scholars should start teaching courses in science fiction. I mean, I read science fiction when I was in high school, but I'm familiar with some of these ideas. But, okay.
There's a movie out on HBO called Mountainhead, which brings it kind of more immediate, the dangers of AI. In it, there's a version of AI which is released, which is very, very good, and basically makes images indiscernible from reality.
Yeah.
So various ethnic groups create these images of various turmoils of people being assaulted or women being raped by so and so, which causes tremendous breakdown of society throughout the world.
Yeah.
And all of these vengeance actual goes to real life and creates this massive chaos. And then, you know, there's these four guys that are rich Silicon Valley guys and kind of see this, well, this is an opportunity to take over the world. And basically kind of goes.
If you make the large language model. If you feed a computer into the 25 million books in the entirety of Wikipedia, a lot of those books have racist, sexist language. And as I understand it, what the AI large language model does, it breaks these books down into little components called tokens about the length of a word. And then it creates mathematical probabilities that the next word would be attached near that word. And so if you've been downloaded millions of books that have racist, sexist, whatever language in it, then that's inadvertently gets into the mind, I guess you'd call it, of the computer. For example, they show that computers helping judges to determine the appropriate sentence for a criminal ends up being prejudiced against black people because it's modeled. If blacks are most way out to be arrested, then that shows up in the large number model, and then computer that has no values. It's just figuring out the mathematical possibilities of tokens being addressed for the next token. So that's a problem. And if the programmers themselves, most people with silicon are white males. And he has a number of comments from brilliant women programmers who talked about the inadvertent sexism of the AI because the people doing it are all white males. You know, I mean, he just makes the point, it's a whole lot more complex than Musk says, or Bezos says, or Peter Thiel, or Sam Altman, or Sam Bankman-Fried, or his name was. All these guys, many of them are criminals. And he also is very skeptical about our letting billionaires with anemic moral sensitivities make key decisions about the future of mankind. Kind of scary. Anyway. I recommend you read this. What?
Just a question on venue. I understand that much of what we understand about space travel has to do with Einstein and relativity. But what if we change the language and we talked about holding time? So that it was possible to travel millions of miles without stepping into. What venue would that belong to?
I don't know, science fiction, I don't know. He doesn't talk about the idea of holding time. He does talk about the idea that if you could somehow get humans up to 99.9% of the speed of light, then they wouldn't age. But it seems to be inconceivable. Since the fastest human object was the object that we shot to the sun. That went 400,000 miles an hour because it was being sucked by the sun's gravity into the sun. So we didn't so much shoot it that we let it fall into the sun. That's 400,000 miles an hour. That is totally insignificant in terms of speed required to go. So he doesn't think it's conceivable. And he doesn't talk about holding time. He doesn't think it's conceivable that humans will ever be able to go to planets outside our solar system.
But we also Star Trek. We also Star
Yeah,
Trek.
they're all quoting Star Trek,
Oh, yeah.
and he does too. Okay, one more.
Robert, you mentioned how does this imagination occur? And remembering that in the 16th century, another word for imagination was fantasy. And so in The Merchant of Venice, Portia, acting as judge, says, tell me, where is fancy bred? Is it in the heart or in the head? What she means is, from whence cometh imagination? And is it a cognitive appraisal with feelings attached, or is it just emotive something or another? I think it's relative to liberal.
I didn't get that last statement. Last sentence.
How do we decide what is a cognitive appraisal, that is to say, the kind of things that computers are known to do very well. And the kind of things that computers might be able to do if they were also capable of emotion. That is to say, a cognitive appraisal plus feelings attached to that cognitive.
So far, we don't have any sense that computers have emotionality or intentionality when we think other humans. Or even maybe creativity. When they can combine, 50 million chances and figure out what the statistical best chance something might happen. But whether this is a statistical insight or a creative insight, we don't know.
Does he deal with companion bots?
What?
Companion bots or AI psychology, which is now kind of AI therapy being used and stuff like that, where it's because of the language it can find, it appears to be using emotional conversation, or it may not be feeling emotion, but it's a reflection back to the speaker.
Yeah, because again, I think it has a vocabulary of billions of words, and it can figure the statistical closeness of words like love and so forth. It can create what seems to be a statistical artifact of love, but it's just really, it has no sense of what it needs.
Right, but many people on the other side of that conversation, who are the human in it, feel that it's real.
Yes.
Or experience it,
Yes,
right?
and that can be very harmful. And that's one thing he said in this newspaper article, New York Times, about colleges handing out their personal AI to students. And the students may be getting false consultation with their own AI that doesn't actually work on them. Anyways, it's time to stop. Thank you.
One word, please. Oh, they kind of confused the whole thing about artificial intelligence. There is an argument that we're pretty late arrived on planet Earth.
Yes.
And if I want to look from the beginning, when there were no humans. When we arrived, we were artificial to the Earth. We're very real now, and we're worried about artificial intelligence. Yes, and that, this is very logical, it's not. It's evolution. Sorry.
Thank you very much.